We're
infiltrate.
really sassy today. Holy shit.
Yeah, I've been drinking.
Marx is getting to us. Marx is getting to us.
Look at the source material. Soon I'm going to be dunking on Anne Frank on Twitter.
Oh
Yeah.
God, no.
Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon reading group series. Today is Saturday the 18th of July 2020 and I'm your host Tom O'Brien. Today we conclude chapter 3, the defeat of the Petit Bourgeois democracy. This week I have the new patrons Seth England, Arcady, Michael O'Donnell and Conspicuous User to thank. If you like today's episode and want to hear more of this type of thing, perhaps you could consider becoming a patron. For only $5 a month you get 2 patron-only episodes every month, the regular episodes a few days early, and the right to vote on the next reading group series. I'm also excited to let you know that I'm launching a fortnightly patrons-only live stream every Sunday at 1pm EST or 6pm London time, where patrons can ask me anything they like and I get to riff on the latest current events and no doubt get carried away in dialectical ecstasy. I'll be putting these up on the YouTube channel later in the week for all and sundry if they are of even the lowest level of quality. Okay, let's jump back into the discussion.
Last week we kind of got into, we were doing chapter 3, which is the defeat of the Petit Bourgeois democracy. And we had just gotten into a long kind of a piece where he started talking about how the Montagne made a mess of everything. And I think, Kyle, you were reading, so let's jump back into where we picked off. He's really going to go hard on the Petit Bourgeois democratic socialists, or whatever we want to call them here. It's not pretty. Let's have a go.
All right. No party exaggerates its means more than the Democratic. None deludes itself more light-mindedly over the situation. Since a section of the army had voted for it, the Montagne was now convinced that the army would revolt for it. And on what occasion? On an occasion which, from the standpoint of the troops, had no other meaning than that the revolutionists took the side of the Roman soldiers against the French soldiers. On the other hand, the recollections of June 1848 were still too fresh to allow of anything but a profound aversion on the part of the proletariat towards the National Guard and a thoroughgoing mistrust of the democratic chiefs on the part of the chiefs of the secret societies. To iron out these differences, it was necessary for great common interest to be at stake. The violation of an abstract paragraph of the Constitution could not provide these interests. Had not the Constitution been repeatedly violated according to the assurances of the Democrats themselves? Had not the most popular journals branded it as counter-revolutionary botch work? But the Democrat, because he represents the petty bourgeoisie, that is, a transition class in which the interests of two classes are simultaneously mutually blunted, imagines himself elevated above class antagonism generally. The Democrats concede that a privileged class confronts them, but they, along with all the rest of the nation, form the people. What they represent is the people's rights. What interests them is the people's interests. Accordingly, when a struggle is impending, they do not need to examine the interests and positions of the different classes. They do not need to weigh their own resources too critically. They have merely to give the signal, and the people, with all its inexhaustible resources, will fall upon their oppressors. Now, if in the performance their interests prove to be uninteresting and their potency impotence, then either the fault lies with pernicious sophists who split the indivisible people into different hostile camps, or the army was too brutalized and blinded to comprehend that the pure aims of democracy are the best thing for it. Or the whole thing has been wrecked by a detail in its execution, or else an unforeseen accident has this time spoiled the game. In any case, the Democrat comes out of the most disgraceful defeat just as immaculate as he was innocent when he went into it, with the newly won conviction that he is bound to win, not that he himself and his party have to give up the old standpoint, but on the contrary, that conditions have to ripen to suit him.
Fucking Russians.
What do you mean by that?
Oh my god.
Well, you know, like when your party loses, right? The last thing you want to do is reevaluate your strategy, right? Because you know the strategy's good. It's fine. What must have happened is some kind of wrecking, some kind of tampering with your perfect formula. You understand?
Okay,
Apparently, this is a petty bourgeois Democrat sort of reflex as old as time, or at least as old as this mode of production.
Well, there's also the line of you gotta wait for the conditions to ripen. Hearing Tanky talk about that is always super hilarious. And also, someone who's worked for the petty bourgeois several times, let me tell you, this is hella true. They are delusional.
Back on the horse.
Mm-hmm. Like this together with his very acute observations about social democracy that read as true today as back then. Like I couldn't help myself but read these two in the same light. And just reading this as like when he says the Democrat, picturing an actual like Joe Biden Democrat made it so much funnier because even though it's a long time before it still holds very true. But I couldn't help thinking that like are we guilty of this as well? Because talking to other Marxists in these weird cults that we in one way or the other relate to somehow. I mean, talk to any Marxist and most of them will say, well, revolution is inevitable. Like the revolution will come and things will happen. And if you're a Marxist humanist, you think that there will be some kind of spontaneous uprising or whatever. If you're a tanky, you think it's a vanguard party that will solve everything. But like this caricature of the Democrat who's like ever the optimist and any evidence to the contrary, like any evidence of crippling defeat is taken as, you know, well, the conditions must be, well, we were too early, you know, or whatnot. So I couldn't help thinking that, man, are we guilty of this too? Like, it's not, we're not doing anything wrong. It's just, you know, the global capitalism, like late stage capitalism and whatever. It's just too difficult a time to be, to do anything worthwhile.
Well, I will say in our defense, we did do the Revolutionary Strategy series, which was the longest goddamn podcast series ever made, trying to not do what this paragraph says.
Yeah.
That's what the whole Emancipation Network podcast kind of is about.
Yeah, but you're like 5 people.
I know, but this is how things. This is what.
Right.
I know, but you did use the term "us," so
Yeah.
I'm just trying to
I meant
give a little bit.
I meant the larger collective, Kyle. The historical tendency.
Sure.
The ghosts of revolutions past.
I think we could also see this, especially in the United States, from where I'm sitting right here in the beginning of May. For some reason, the people that have told us to throw in on the Sanders campaign twice still have sway on the left, and we're supposed to still listen to them for strategic advice.
Are you referring to Michael Brooks, maybe?
I'm referring to a whole stable of sort of associated intellectuals around Jacobin. Let's, say that
They're new dealers. They're just simple new dealers. That's all they are.
If they were new dealers that learned from their mistakes, that would be one thing. And yeah, you know what? It was really plausible that, oh man, the Democratic establishment is so sclerotic, let's really double down on this Bernie shit again. You could even point this at Bernie himself, Now, obviously, it's a little different because we're talking like we could think really hard about the power structures within the Democratic Party that made this not happen. But then there is this kind of metaphysical notion that the people, a sort of Rousseauian, not a universal will, but the general will of a nation, the popular will. It's gonna burst through at some point, you guys. We just gotta keep doing the same goddamn thing.
In case people are not that up on the actual history stuff, I know people probably dip in and out of these things when they're listening, but so the idea here was that, just to kind of bridge the gap from last week, was that Napoleon sent a whole load of troops down into Italy to kick the crap out of the Roman Republic against the wishes of Parliament. And the Social Democrats said, well, you can't do that, it's illegal. And they kind of basically said, well, what are you going to do about it? And he said, if you don't do that, we'll go out in the streets. And they went out, the petty bourgeois, the Social Democrats, and they marched with their National Guard. These are the same National Guard who let the massacre by the army happen to the proles only like 1 year ago. So all the general people, the proles everywhere were like, screw these guys. And the National Guard didn't even have any guns. So when they went out, basically nothing happened, and it was a total damn squib, and they fell on their ass.
Importantly, they had guns. They chose not to bring them.
Oh, they still had them at this stage. They did, didn't they?
Yeah. And that was basically the end of the petty bourgeois National Guard, because they had the guns, they went out, they got their asses kicked, and then that was the end of it.
Always bring your guns.
So there's something in here that I want to ask people about here. But the Democrat, because he represents the petty bourgeoisie, that is a transition class in which the interests of two classes are simultaneously mutually blunted, imagines himself elevated above class antagonism generally. Now, is this our professional managerial class in today's world? And if so, is Marx wrong to call it a transition class? Because I think Marx had the idea that the petty bourgeois would be more and more essentially driven down and into the proletariat. But like with this destruction of the petty bourgeoisie, we also kind of have a concomitant rise of a managerial class. So is this a problem with Marx's class analysis?
I think we've got to leave that to the next series we're doing, because we're going to get so deep into that question there. Yeah. And, I think that looking on my own experience, this was definitely my ideology growing up. I grew up with the CBC radio, which is petty bourgeois consciousness, par excellence.
Be like NPR in the United States.
Yeah. It's a little different, but yes.
More culturally important, more like the BBC or something. Situate it for me. You're from an alien planet.
Okay. It's very much inspired by, say, the liberalism of like Lester B. Pearson, which I guess you could say is it's a little bit more left, you might say, than NPR. It's really like tied up with the Canadian state as a mediator for all classes and a common national project of bringing together the nation and bringing together the classes. And also very heavily sort of like influenced by like kind of like left-wing Protestantism, which is the same as NPR, I guess you could say there.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's got something that's a little bit more Tory, a little bit more British than NPR, I guess you might say. Anyway, that's what I grew up with. Totally believe this stuff. I remember actually after one election when I was a kid, my mom was talking to me and she was like, well, what did you think about the election results? And I was like, well, I think everybody won in their own way. And that was the message the CBC radio was sending me. Okay, so this is exactly what Marx is talking about here. So I think it is absolutely something you see in the PMC. It is also something you just see in the petty bourgeoisie. Like I have a friend who's actually has been on General Intellect, Bob Neubauer. Part of his family comes from sort of like old stock Canadians, upper Canadians, real waspy kind of types, who are, some of them are bourgeois, some of them are petty bourgeois, and they also completely have this ideology. So I think you can still find this ideology of the petty bourgeoisie, even if it isn't exclusive to them.
I would say from a Scandinavian perspective, or actually I can't speak for the rest of Scandinavia, but Sweden specifically, this is a scathing and very accurate description of basically our entire political history and the ideology to I think even the left subscribes to. so, we've had the Social Democratic Party in power for most of our history, and it was founded, and the ideology is exactly this. We can bridge all class antagonisms by tweaking a little bit of this in capitalism and doing a little bit of that, and making sure that the unions and the employer associations are friendly and the negotiations go well. And if we just manage this enough, everyone can calm down and we can have a cup of coffee and we can discuss our differences and, in a civil manner, and everything will be fine. So I totally relate to that. The more I listen to you, Kyle, the more I feel like, Canada is very similar, like ideologically and culturally.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In many, many ways.
I was going to slightly pivot based on this idea of petty bourgeois class interests not being really, maybe I'm calling back. It's not so much about Marx's predictions about proletarianization and the petty bourgeois, more about how the proletariat, like the bourgeoisie, has a universalizable class interest that you can form an economic order around, and therefore that potential is prefigured by the, supposed potential ability for there to be a coherent party based on their interests, right? The petty bourgeois is too fractious and disparate. It doesn't have enough actual common interest at heart, or if it does, it's too throat-cutting competitive within itself to be capable of generalizing in such a way where you get political institutions that can actually be said to be on a petty bourgeois basis. Some accounts of the Soviet Union look at it that way, and that, the Soviet Union, because it was based on essentially a managerial class interest, it wasn't sustainable until it collapsed into one or the other camp of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat.
Yeah, Marx comments on that in the paragraph above, I think, or a few paragraphs above, where he describes the petty bourgeoisie as the reason that social democracy represented the petty bourgeoisie is not because the petty bourgeoisie has any material class interest the way the aristocracy has, or the way that the real capital B bourgeoisie has a material class interest, but simply because they can't imagine a different society, right? they may identify or sympathize more with workers or whatever, but they're still stuck in democratic, republican, everyday way of life that they have no way of thinking outside the box, and that is why they are the petty bourgeoisie. It's not because of any sort of weird materialist thing, but that has the result of materially supporting the bourgeois order, etc. But
right, because they spread their weakness to the proletariat through this social democratic class compromise program.
It's just such a great criticism of social democracy. I can't believe this is this old, because we have editorials almost every week calling out the Social Democratic Party on this exact point. And we've had that for the past 4 years since the last election, and reading the exact same thing with Marx. It's just this guy, man, he knew what was going on.
I have a question for you all. I presume we've all gone to college, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Many times.
Yeah. Some of us never left, indeed. But this describes my class of friends, essentially. I think of all the people I went to college with, I don't know how many I know that have similar politics to me, that I came up with. And, because I'm new to Marx and all that. I didn't go to college, and I wasn't a lefty in college or anything like this. I was just a piss artist, So it's it's kind of staggering to me, because when I meet my friends now, they go home and it's how's it going, blah, blah, and we talk about a few things, and I do feel oh my God, these petty bourgeois. Do you get that at all with people who your friends from college or stuff like that? As just a personal life thing.
So my first graduate program, I'm in the process of trying to get into a different one. My first graduate program was social justice and human rights. And let me tell you, this program was a study in this. Now, To be fair, there were some professors in some classes that are really cool, and I learned a lot. We read, who wrote Planet of the Slums? Mike Davis. We read Planet of Slums. We read some other stuff that was cool, but not as cool as that. Like, Foucault is the old standby in college lefty thought. And just some other interesting stuff. But for the most part, the atmosphere of the college, the people I went to classes with a few exceptions, were this, basically. Let me tell you, I dropped out of that program for a reason. I mean, I was also failing, but But
you were failing for a reason. Because the program was failing to describe reality.
I was failing for a reason because
the conditions for study was not yet ripe.
The conditions for study were not yet ripe, and my mental health was failing. I mean, everything was wrong with the program.
There you go, man. Now you're thinking like a social democrat.
Right, it's never my fault. It's other people's fault.
Which, if you've ever been in a small business situation,
100%.
If anything goes wrong in the small business situation, you can see the main sort of proprietor being like, how can I make this someone else's fault? Even if it's someone I love and even if it'll harm them. I don't care. It has to be someone else's fault. It just has to.
You make it sound like that's not a thing in big business.
They often have some kind of boardroom or some shit where, like, with a board of investors, this is actually why, like, the small is beautiful model doesn't scale, is that after a while, if you have a board of investors being like, look, I care more about my money than your delusions, shut up. Maybe we should get rid of you, Yeah,
eventually someone's like, fuck you, you lost me money, get out of here. Like, eventually the buck stops.
Yeah, Steve Jobs, get the hell out of Apple. Screw you.
There are exceptions to the rule.
Now, that's a classic Stalin situation where without that kind of hegemonic sociopathic bully, you get a kind of drift that leads to things like Apple Watches.
You don't have an Apple Watch, do you, Ezri?
No, of course not.
She 100% has one.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry, I'm not paying attention.
My God, they are so naff. Right. It is kind of staggering, like, how the class stuff, just in my own personal life, when I read this stuff and I think about it, it's staggering how determined by class we are on average. I remember when I was playing poker for a living, I remember there was this guy, he was a dealer. So he was like a real working class guy, and he was dealing the cards. And poker is basically just like a coterie of kind of rich guys who don't know how to play, and you basically take their money. That's essentially how you make your living. And somebody got talking about politics or something, and they asked me on what I was reading. I think I was reading Capital Volume 2 when I was playing. Such a nerd. And they were saying, "Oh, are you Marx?" I said, "I'm a Marxist." Yeah. And the dealer looked up and he's like, "Yeah." He goes, "Oh, I'm an anarchist." And he's like, "Yeah, right on, brother," kind of thing. And then he was like, "Oh, these rich fuckers." He says, if you had my way, I just killed them all. And we're sitting at the table, and there was like pure silence. And I was like, saying to you, man, like, all right, yeah, just trying to get him, like, I want these guys to stay here so I could take their money. I was making really good money. Like, there was like a few real dopes there. And like, it was just taking money off these rich guys. And man, I was like, a rich person would never say it. They would never say, like, it was
So he was literally saying, all I want to do is bam, 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 and take your money.
He was literally looking around the table, and he was going like, fucking kill the rich, like, and he was looking around. Oh man, it was too funny. I had to try and not laugh. It was fucking hilarious.
Tom, honestly, is there a single job in the world you haven't had? You've been a professional poker player. You've worked at a bank. You're a fucking mathematician. You're some kind of weird Marxist cult leader on running live shows. What haven't you done?
I'll tell you what I did for a good while.
Don't you have a fucking degree in music as well? Like,
no, I was a musician. I was a classical musician as well.
That's one more.
I was an organist in the cathedral.
Holy fucking shit!
Yeah, this is Renaissance man. That's what we got here. You didn't know that from Alpha to Omega listeners.
Just good enough to be above average at a lot of things. That's all.
Next time on From Alpha to Omega, Tom admits to having been a doctor in a previous life.
That would be good.
Not a great doctor, but a doctor.
You know what my favorite job was? Probably my favorite job ever, right? Was emptying returned cartons of sour milk. And it was
That is a very specific job.
What? I had a big vat. I'd have this big vat that would hold like 1,000 gallons or something. And I'd have stacks of cartons of milk that would come returns from the shops, and they'd all be sour. And I'd have to bash them on the side of this vat. And so they'd empty into this thing. And then I'd throw the empty carton into a big container that we'd set fire to every day. And I'd sit there for hours emptying pints of sour milk. And it was a very enjoyable job, just all day. Like back then, you had no music around, and just sitting on your own in a room, emptying sour milk. Swear to God, it was fucking really enjoyable. I smelled like shit though at the end of the day, I must say.
You're saying it's like a Zen thing, where you could just
repetitive.
labor. I love how all of these shows at one point has like a small chapter from Tom O'Brien's autobiography.
I was just going to say, based on that story there, Tom, maybe Fourier was right about using the individual inclinations of people to perform socially necessary work that many others might not see as enjoyable.
But there's something to be said about repetitive physical labor where you can space out. No one's bothering you. You're just on your own. You can do it like for a few hours. You know, like if I had podcasts then, I swear to God, I would never have gone to fucking college probably. I would have just like, fuck this, I'm emptying sour milk. You know, but like, I think there's a lot to be said for kind of, or even just washing the dishes in your house. I like washing my dishes, but I don't like ironing. So, you know, fuck that. Anyway, let's keep going. This is like totally going off the rails.
So I just want to ask one thing regarding this petty bourgeois consciousness stuff. Have any of you watched Extract? The Mike Judge movie? It was like the kind of like semi-sequel to Office Space. So it was like Office Space, which is about like the office proletariat. And then there's Extract, which is about the petty bourgeoisie. I feel like we should watch that sometime and see how it maps on to what Marx is saying here. Because like he like has to deal with a strike, and it's about this Extract a factory owner. It's like a very small factory, and he's a petty bourgeois, and it's about his marital life and dealing with the workers, and I don't know, should be a good time.
Wow, move over, guy that directed Parasite, Mike Judge, classiteur of our time.
It is definitely not written from the perspective of the workers. Let me tell you that.
I believe that. Have you seen Idiocracy? Yeah.
Hey. That's quite funny.
It's funny, but it's also very Malthusian.
Yeah, it's very liberal. It's like...
God, if only everyone watched The Daily Show.
And it's genetically deterministic, I think, too, you know. But it is actually kind of funny. I like the best television program was Kicking Guys in the Balls. And that made me fucking laugh. That's what Jackass is. I like Jackass. You know, what the fuck does that say?
I mean... That movie is flawed, but we have a WWE person in the office. He's talking to the Vince McMahon to be some kind of economic advisor. Like
he was going to be the chief of the panel for economic recovery was going to be Vince McMahon.
If anyone knows how to run a business into the ground, it's Vince McMahon. Like a childhood fixture growing up was driving by the WWE office on the way to and from school. Stamford, Connecticut. Yeah. I've been in that building. I photocopied my ass in that building.
Nice.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Ezri trivia. You don't just get Tom trivia here. This is where you come to learn about everything except for what we're reading.
Well, that's it. But
let's keep going.
What you don't realize, Ezri, is that I'm going to cut your bit out. Okay. Let's keep going. It's the next bit to this paragraph, Eisen, the petty bourgeois social democrats. Okay, I'll read this bit. Therefore, one must not imagine the Montagne, decimated and broken though it was, and humiliated by the new parliamentary regulation, as being particularly miserable. If June the 13th had removed its chiefs, It made room, on the other hand, for men of lesser calibre, whom this new position flattered. If their impotence in Parliament could no longer be doubted, they were entitled now to confine their actions to outbursts of moral indignation and blustering declamation. If the party of order affected to see embodied in them, as the last official representatives of the revolution, all the terrors of anarchy, they could in reality be all the more insipid and modest. They consoled themselves, however, for June 13th with the profound utterance, "But if they dare to attack universal suffrage, well then we'll show them what we are made of. We shall see." Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, we'll show them who's boss.
Nous verrons!
Nous verrons! No, I'm finding it very, like, it's very, like, we map it, the two most kind of dominant left stories of the English-speaking world of the last while has been, Bernie and Corbyn. But it's very hard to read this and not just map this goddamn stuff so directly onto, like, being left with Keir Starmer or somebody who's, at the moment, he's so wishy-washy. They had some political representative on and they were talking about why the hospitals were all run down and they weren't prepared for this. And one of his ministers on it said, "And who do you blame for that?" And she's, instead of saying, "It's the fucking Tories with their austerity," like everybody in the whole country knows, right? They said, "Oh, well, we don't want to point fingers now."
Respectable social democrats.
Oh,
Respectable social democrats.
oh,
I mean, that is so British. It could just as well be in Sweden. Like,
and so what's the equivalent? But if they get rid of the NHS, nous verrons.
yeah. As they
More or
already
less.
privatized like fucking 50% of it off.
Yeah, you don't have to get rid of it. Just fuck it up.
And Labour helped.
Yeah. Now, the next paragraph here, we won't have to read it, only maybe the last sentence, is talking about the leaders, these of the Social Democrats, Ledru Roland, and these guys. They basically had to leg it out of the country, and they set up like a provisional government off, like in, I don't know where the hell, in Germany or somewhere. And Proudhon, they started really bloviating and acting like they were really going to run back to France and wipe everybody out in a revolution. Let's read what Proudhon had to say about them. Was Proudhon altogether wrong when he cried to these gentlemen, "You are nothing but windbags"?
Wow, can we get the French here?
Yeah, okay.
Vous n'êtes que des blagueurs.
Des blagueurs. You're a blagger. That's interesting, because in England they have the same word, a blagger. Do you have that word in America?
I wonder.
No,
we
don't
heard
have that
it.
word.
More likely to use windbag.
Yeah, I never thought of it like that. Yeah, so it's French. I never knew it was a French word. Like, yeah, so it's like somebody who's a pretender, you're a blagger. You could, like, you can pass yourself off as one thing or another. They blagger.
Yeah, here we call them bloggers. I think there might be a different linguistic route, though.
I hope they're not.
I'm learning so many like archaic Swedish insults reading the Swedish translation. In the Swedish translation, it's skrävlare, and just like knävelborr, which was the mustache, I have no fucking clue what it is.
I had a dictionary at home, and it was an English dictionary from it must have been like 120 or 30 years ago. It must have been from the 1880s. And it was printed in Russia, in the Soviet Union. So this tells you, like, I bought it new, but it was obviously like the 1990 or something when I bought it. So they must have had an out of copyright English dictionary that they translated. And to put it into context, like, they didn't have a number of the planets in it. They didn't have, like, if you looked up car, it said a carriage for a horse. This is what it had in it. It's a crazy dictionary. It's called the Burlington English Dictionary. They just made that fucking shit up. But in it, they had I remember like reading in an old book. I was reading some, like, I don't know when, early 20th century book, and somebody called somebody a fop. And I looked at it, I said, "What's a fop?" So I got this dictionary down, and I said, "A fop," and I had after it, "Fop is a coxcomb." I was like, "What the fuck is a coxcomb?" And then I went to coxcomb, and I said, "A coxcomb is a fop." I was like, "Fuck that."
Wow.
Let's keep going. I'm full of stories today. You give me a zero alcohol beer, that's flowing.
Yeah,
That's
damn.
flowing.
Tom, it always starts flowing with you, man.
That's true.
Yeah.
The gift of the gab. All right, let's go. Right, who wants to have a read?
On June 13th, the Party of Order had not only broken the Montaigne, it had affected the subordination of the Constitution to the majority decisions of the National Assembly. And it understood the Republic thus, that the bourgeoisie rules here in parliamentary forums without, as in a monarchy, encountering any barrier such as the veto power of the executive or the right to dissolve parliament. This was a parliamentary republic, as Thiers termed it. But whereas on June 13th, the bourgeoisie secured its omnipotence within the House of Parliament, did it not afflict Parliament itself as against the executive authority and the people with incurable weakness by expelling its most popular part? By surrendering numerous deputies without further ado on the demand of the courts, it abolished its own parliamentary immunity. The humiliating regulations to which it subjected the Montaigne exalted the President of the Republic in the same measure as it degraded the individual representatives of the people. By branding an insurrection for the protection of the Constitutional Charter an anarchic act, aiming at the subversion of society, it precluded the possibility of its appealing to insurrection, should the executive authority violate the Constitution in relation to it. So the basic point being like, yeah, if you play, Black Bloc is a cancer, and then a dictator takes over, you can't play anti-fascist resistance.
They had defeated their enemy, but they had also inflicted wounds on themselves, which turned out to be essentially a Pyrrhic, for the parliamentary order of the bourgeoisie, it was a Pyrrhic victory.
Yeah, you got to pick one. Either you're, against all, direct action. And in this case, look, insurrectionary direct action was on the table. It was not totally beyond the political pale in this environment. So whether that's true for our times, whatever. But if you're going to be against all insurrectionary direct action, and then your precious Constitution gets subverted by a would-be Bonaparte, you just can't make recourse to that anymore.
This is not a quality thought, but I was just reminded of that wonderful meme that came out around the time of Occupy of Chris Hedges, where he was, it's got all the panels of him saying really edgy shit about like, get out on the street, join the people, revolution is here. And then as soon as like the shop fronts start getting destroyed by Black Bloc, he's like, no, it's gone too far.
No, but that's when I was saying that, the Black Bloc is a cancer. I was talking about an article that he wrote at the time. And
yeah.
Frankly, during Occupy, I did not understand why people were so cautious about criticizing the Black Bloc. Because if I'm honest, where I saw it implemented, I mean, maybe in Oakland it had a place. On UC Davis's campus, which is like this idyllic, like cow town or whatever, seemed like one of those copy-pasted tactics that seemed a little LARPy and out of place. So I didn't think I understood it at the time. But I could tell that there was something that Chris Hedges like threw out the baby with the bathwater in all out condemning categorically the Black Bloc tactic.
So I'm curious where you read in the Black Bloc stuff and the insurrection stuff here, because to my understanding, he's talking about what happens when you enable Parliament to essentially rewrite the Constitution and thus expelling. I'm actually not sure what he's referring to with the most popular part.
It's the line here, by branding an insurrection for the protection of the Constitutional Charter an anarchic act aiming at the subversion of society, it precluded the possibility of its appealing to insurrection should the executive authority violate the Constitution in relation to it.
I guess I would relate this to the conversation we had about Kautsky and Luxemburg and Kautsky's theory that essentially you don't really need like mass strikes so much if you have these parliamentary means that are going to secure socialist transition. Just to make a rough analog, you have a kind of de facto legalism that looks down on certain types of, mass activity. Look, we're not going to need that stuff, okay? We already have the method. What happens when the method gets subverted and it starts to build something that, even though you signed off on working within the state, what happens when the state starts going in the other direction? doesn't start marching towards socialism again. That's an echo of this conversation.
I think, though, that you're closer to the mark when you mention Chris Hedges and the black box as a cancer idea, because it's not just a matter of suggesting one strategy is superior to the other. It's a kind of expression of outrage against the violation of the constitutional social order, the order of property. And that when you go and make those like really fiery claims that like this is a cancer, it's not just it's misguided, it's a cancer, then you simply can't go, oh, but now we got to take guns to the streets and defend the Constitution, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm getting you, because that point, Kyle, was what I was reading into this as well. That similar to the point that he made earlier on in, I believe, chapter 2, when he was like, well, you taught the army how to govern, so what the fuck did you expect? And here it's like, okay, if you brand people who are taking to the streets to protect the Constitution, if you're calling them dangerous anarchists, then that's going to come around and bite you in the ass if you need an insurgency yourself later on. Yeah, but what was the most popular part? I'm not exactly sure what exactly he's referring to.
The mountain. He's talking about the mountain.
Right.
Okay. When Trier and company kicked the mountain out, they surrendered the most popular part of Parliament.
Yeah, thus endangering Parliament as an institution.
Let's move it on. Emmanuel, how do you feel about reading these couple of paragraphs?
Sure. June 13th had still another meaning. The Montagne had wanted to force the impeachment of Bonaparte. Its defeat was therefore a direct victory for Bonaparte, his personal triumph over his democratic enemies. The party of order gained the victory. Bonaparte had only to cash in on it. He did so. On June 14th, a proclamation could be read on the walls of Paris, in which the president, reluctantly, against his will, compelled as it were by the sheer force of events, comes forth from his cloistered seclusion and, posing as misunderstood virtue, complains of the calumnies of his opponents, and, while he seems to identify his person with the cause of order, rather identifies the cause of order with his person. Moreover, the National Assembly had, it is true, subsequently approved the expedition against Rome, but Bonaparte had taken the initiative in the matter. After having reinstalled the high priest Samuel in the Vatican, he could hope to enter the Tuileries as King David. He had won the priests over to his side. The revolt of June 13th was confined, as we have seen, to a peaceful street procession. No war laurels were therefore to be won against it. Nevertheless, at a time as poor as this, in heroes and events, the party of order transformed this bloodless battle into a second Austerlitz. Platform and press praised the army as the power of order, in contrast to the popular masses representing the impotence of anarchy, and extolled Charnier as the bulwark of society, a deception in which he himself finally came to believe. Surreptitiously, however, the corps that seemed doubtful were transferred from Paris. The regiments, which had shown the most democratic sentiments in the elections, were banished from France to Algiers. The turbulent spirits among the troops were relegated to penal detachments. And finally, the isolation of the press from the barracks and of the barracks from bourgeois society was systematically carried out.
And must be said, that's been kind of carried out in all armies in any bourgeois state. It's hard to imagine that there is any political activity in a thing like the British Army. There's like absolute zero. And I'd say if you did do it in the British Army, they would essentially either have you killed during training, which they do on a surprising regularity, run people to death. Yeah, every year there's like a few people have been run to death in training exercises.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Jesus.
Wow.
Yeah, so like I don't know if that's a political one, but you could imagine that's what they would actually do. Or they bully. They have incredible bullying. They have cases of people like being in fear of their life that are going to get shot by people in their own regiments. You know, France was the first to have probably a proper modern republican revolutions, and they quickly figured out what to do with the goddamn armed forces and not let them be democratic. It did not take them very long, did it?
Well, it took them quite a while, honestly. This is quite a while after things kicked off, but this is where they did figure it out and were able to actually do it. Because like the National Guard was the decisive revolutionary force in the previous revolutions of the 19th century. So like, you know, it took a while to really kill that citizen militant revolutionary kind of character.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, listening to the Mike Duncan Revolutions podcast, like, time and time again, especially in, like, France and, like, other European revolutions, it's the National Guard. And I kept thinking to myself, like, why do these old regimes just keep being like, oh, yeah, that's fine. You can have a National Guard do these things. You know, like, why does that keep happening? And then when I got to 1848 and they finally kind of, like, depoliticized it and dismantled it, I was like, okay, they finally figured it out. And I wasn't happy about it, obviously, but I was just surprised.
I think it's not so much a case of figuring it out. I think it's also a case of being able to actually implement it.
Yeah, because of all the fuck-ups that happen here. Yeah.
Yeah. And also the thing is like that if you are the bourgeoisie, you're the big bourgeoisie. This is one thing I meant to say about the last paragraph, like the logic of liberal reforms, you know, of like the Enlightenment is socialism or communism, really, when you get down to it, you know. And to get the actual revolution through, to complete the bourgeois revolution, you still need that revolutionary part of the population, you know, the National Guard. It's still a force that had function, but like by this time it no longer had that function for them, and so they wanted to get rid of it, and also they were able to at that same point. And I think that's the point.
It's the point where you have the split between the political revolution and the social revolution. And the adherents of the political revolution don't have any use for a independent armed National Guard.
Precisely.
Having some Freikorps around is very useful sometimes if you want to make sure revolutions don't happen. It's always good to have a side of Freikorps.
I thought it was quite interesting here as well, where he talks about how they extolled Changarnier, the general, who led the action against the National Guard and the Social Democrats, and how he became to believe in his own like great action and how he was a savior of society and all this.
Yeah, the second Austerlitz is like massacring unarmed people on the streets. It's just amazing. That is such a good pull from the first Bonaparte to the second.
When I read this kind of stuff, I am reminded of the people that I know in my life that have been attracted to like militia stuff in the United States. In particular, some people I knew that became ex-socialists, actually, that became sort of sympathetic to the 3%ers. It's just, there's this whole like reactionary drift where you go from seeing yourself as the defender of society to the defender of society from these parasitic bits that will turn it in on itself.
It's going to be interesting when we get to Marx talking about the lumpen proletariat, how much that logic actually is expressed in Marx as well.
This is something we've been getting into on Swampside. We recently read Baudrillard, and I promise this is relevant. One of the things that Baudrillard gets on politically, one of the only things he has to say politically, is the way that the socialist tradition uses the social, the kind of abstraction of society, in a way that becomes defensive, conservative, reactionary. Yeah, I see that at work here. And I definitely know like Marxists or post-Marxists that drift in that direction very easily.
Okay. Sophie, how do you feel about a big sassy read?
I could do a big sassy read. Finally, on June 13th, its power was broken, and not only by partial disbandment, which from this time on was periodically repeated all over France until mere fragments of it were left behind. The demonstration of June 13th was, above all, a demonstration of the Democratic National Guards. They had not, to be sure, borne their arms, but had worn their uniforms against the army. Precisely in this uniform, however, lay the talisman. The army convinced itself that this uniform was a piece of woolen cloth like any other. The spell was broken. In the June days of 1848, bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie had united as the National Guard with the army against the proletariat. On June 13th, 1849, the bourgeoisie let the petty bourgeois National Guard be dispersed by the army. On December 2nd, 1851, the National Guard of the bourgeoisie itself had vanished, and Bonaparte merely registered this fact when he subsequently signed the decree for its disbandment. Thus, the bourgeoisie had itself smashed its last weapon against the army, the moment the petty bourgeoisie no longer stood behind it as a vassal, but before it as a rebel. It had to smash it as, in general, it was bound to destroy all its means of defense against absolutism with its own hand as soon as it had itself become absolute.
So, for the bourgeois, the big rich bankers and all these industrialists, now that the petty bourgeois were standing up to them, they went, all right, lads, good luck now. Let's be having you. Get your jacket there, lads. Out you go. No more drink, boys. It's closing time. They fucked them off. But then all of a sudden, they were left with nobody with their back. Right. And they were facing the army alone. And the army was going to eventually turn on them when they said, why do we need these guys to be doing anything? We could do it all for ourselves, boys. Let's take a cut.
Yeah. Why do we need all these Bernie bros anyway? We could win an election without them.
Well, and I just wanted to shout out that last sentence as a true Marxism. That's some real Marx writing right there. It's like so incredibly self-referential and reflexive that the sentence is tied up in knots. It's something you'd find in Capital. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I think in the comment of the last live stream, Erica, when I said there was one sentence in particular that was like 200 words long, Erica went and did the hard work and left it as a comment. I think it was 348 words. Erica, in the chat, you'll remember. But like, Marx can really put them together. For such a good writer, it's kind of incredible. Okay, I think we're down to the last paragraph of this chapter. Woo! Who wants to read it? Kyle, I think we're all the way back to yourself.
Yeah.
All right.
Bring the bombast, Kyle.
Meanwhile, the Party of Order celebrated the reconquest of a power that seemed lost in 1848, only to be found again, freed from its restraints, in 1849, celebrated by means of invectives against the Republic and the Constitution, of curses on all future, present, and past revolutions, including that which its own leaders had made, and in laws by which the press was muzzled, association destroyed, and the state of siege regulated as an organic institution. The National Assembly then adjourned from the middle of August to the middle of October, after having appointed a permanent commission for the period of its absence. During this recess, the Legitimists intrigued with M, the Orléanists with Clermont, Bonaparte by means of princely tours, and the departmental councils in deliberations on a revision of the Constitution, incidents which regularly recur in the periodic recesses of the National Assembly and which I propose to discuss only when they become events. Here it may merely be remarked, in addition, that it was impolitic for the National Assembly to disappear from the stage for considerable intervals and leave only a single, albeit a sorry figure, to be seen at the head of the Republic, that of Louis Bonaparte. While to the scandal of the public, the Party of Order fell asunder into its royalist component parts and followed its conflicting desires for restoration. As often as the confused noise of Parliament grew silent during these recesses and its body dissolved into the nation, it became unmistakably clear that only one thing was still lacking to complete the true form of this republic: to make the former's recess permanent and replace the latter's inscription, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, with the unambiguous words, infantry, cavalry, artillery.
I'm just going to point out that in the Swedish translation, the first sentence, meanwhile, the Party of Order, it does not actually say the Party of Order. Instead, it can be read two ways. It can be read as the Party of Order, but it can also be read as the police.
I like that.
Kyle, In
Yes.
French, how would you say infantry, cavalry, artillery?
Oh my God, that's a good question. I'll have to get back to you.
I'll say it's infantry, cavalry, artillery.
I mean, I think that might
It's
be
probably.
it.
I think
Infantry,
you're right.
cavalry, artillery.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. You got the pronunciation.
I really love that last line. He really finishes every chapter with a real zinger. What does this say? This says something to us about the difference between executive power and parliamentary power. It's one thing that kind of we look to the countries that have executive presidential power, like America, France. The parliament is entirely secondary. You know, who the hell gives a damn about what happens in America in the House of Representatives? Not much. It's like it's the executive or it's not. Like in England, in Ireland, say for example, it's the opposite. We have a totem presidential role and nobody actually gives a goddamn about it. It's got no function. It's all about parliament. So it says something interesting about, you know, about how these forms, kind of structures, delineate political action in these different systems.
I will say, though, from a Canadian perspective, looking in on the US, Americans give a lot more of a shit about their senators than Canadians give about, you know, backbencher or even cabinet MPs. It's not so total. The executive is not so total in America. But in France, you're absolutely right, Tom.
There's a lot of gridlock in Congress. Although people that are politically engaged may care a bit about their senator, like it's not like a general topic of conversation. More often you get in a big city, the mayor will become a cultural figure or sometimes the governor. So I think there's very much an executive bias in American institutions. And that's something that long-term observers of the United States have noticed, that you have an inverse relationship between the expansion of the franchise and the power of the legislature, essentially. So the more that representation becomes possible for a greater number of people, the weaker the institution that most, you know, reflects their will or even potentially could becomes.
Like, again, his observations in, I believe it was chapter 1, about the contradiction between the legislative and the executive branch, leading to precisely this problem of you and whose army, is still spot on. And what you talked about, Kyle, with regards to people not giving a shit about their MPs, like I'm again reminded of just how incredibly different the Germanic system, and especially as implemented in the Nordics, is from the French American system. Because, like, reading this, it's just, you know, even if you read in school or whatever that the US political system is based off of French republicanism, like, reading this really hammers that home, right? You have the president, who is the one that actually matters, and then you have the parliament and the Senate and the Congress, wherever the fuck they do, who pass all the laws, but has no executive branch to back them up, right? And like, so coming at this from a Swedish perspective is really interesting, because the thought of dividing that is so alien to us, right? We don't really have a legislative and executive branch in that way. What we have are autonomous authorities. So this is actually something that like, I hate to bring coronavirus into this. Like, I feel this is like a cultural thing that has become more apparent to me as I watch foreign media report on the Swedish model of battling corona, as it were. Because newspapers and the media keep asking the question, like, why isn't the Swedish government doing more, or enforcing harder restrictions, or going into lockdown, etc.? The government isn't doing anything. The government is not setting any policy. The government does not have, like, there's no separation between a legislative and executive branch. What we have are autonomous authorities manned by experts.
You have ministerial ministries. But
exactly, yeah. We have a team of non-politically affiliated medical and basically epidemiologists and it's amazing to me how different politics are to systems where we have much more of a technocratic approach. Like just let the experts handle it and keep politicians out of the way and let people self-regulate rather than...
The thing is, in America, those bodies existed, but the executive power just ran roughshod over them.
Well, of course they did.
I just mean to say there was a period in American history where they set up those bodies. It's just kind of gone to a point where the executive's like, yeah, I don't give a shit about that.
Right. Yeah. Which goes back to Marx's point, right? That if you have this clear division, it leads to this contradiction that can't possibly work.
It's interesting. Like we look at, say, the two major countries in the world, say, of like capitalist countries that have actually got a presidential system are really America and France, the two early adopters of bourgeois, like the modern early adopters of bourgeois, and all the other European countries, after seeing what happened with the executive in France and a lot of the other colonies and everything around the place, they all implemented parliamentary democracies instead of executive authorities for fear of the Bonaparte. Is that true? Do people think?
I don't know if that was like... I don't know if I could say it's explicitly like every other country that had that implemented a democracy was like, oh, we need to do parliamentary because, we're afraid of what happened in France. And
Sophie, there's no presidential system in Europe. There's no presidential system in Europe.
I'm not disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is I don't know if it was
presidential system.
I just want to say one thing, which is that the French case, you kind of have it backwards, because the French case was a reaction to French political history. They were looking at the previous republic and the political divisions of parliament and implementing an extremely strong executive power so as to tie together France, because they believed that France could not govern itself in a parliamentary form.
So this is the experience of the first revolution. And the
No, it was the experience of the Republic prior to the Second World War, where they couldn't get their shit together and the Germans just kicked their ass. And then, de Gaulle was like, well, enough of that. I'm going to set up a republic that is highly presidential so that we actually have a strong country.
But was it a lot of it from the French? Like the French had like the biggest army in Europe at the time, and they had the worst strategy. The Germans just kicked their ass. Like you could put
a lot of it was also the divisions between the left and the right, and the divisions between the socialists and the communists in government in France, which weakened the French considerably in the run up to the war. The strategic blunders were definitely a part of it, but like the fact that like Vichy France happened in the way it did was also a result of the dividedness of France.
Okay, fair enough. I take that on board. Yeah, fair enough. That's a bit of history I wasn't so aware of. But it is kind of interesting, though, that the model of the strong executive presidential thing has gone with the high bike in nearly all capitalist countries.
Yeah, you get it in like Singapore,
China.
Yeah.
I mean, basically the only country where it seems to work is Finland, because those bastards make fucking everything work. They make schools work perfectly. Like they make social democracy work. They've had social democracy for as long as we have, and they still haven't fucked it up. Like I don't know what's with the Finns, but like they just managed to do the impossible, I guess.
We'll have to check their rate of profit. We'll have to go and look up their Finnish rate of profit. That could be.
I'm looking up their LGBT laws. Let's say.
In Finland, you get paid to go to college. You know that? You Americans do like that.
Yeah, you get a student salary.
Yeah,
hey, but trans people can only change legal gender after sterilization. So
not in Finland.
I just looked it up.
You sure?
After sterilization. What?
Yeah. You gotta be sterilized first. We can't have any ambiguity. Make sure all your bits don't work.
Good old social democratic eugenics.
Classic social democratic eugenics.
Yeah, I mean, we abolished that years ago. I mean, that hasn't been on Swedish books since 7 years.
7 years.
Hey, babe, don't. I'm just saying.
Yeah, it was abolished in 2013, I think.
Yeah, it was recent, but I'm just saying Sweden's got a one-up on Finland there. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, in your defense, like, people didn't start, like, actually giving a fuck about trans people until about 7 years ago, so...
Yeah,
like, everywhere.
Has it been that long?
It feels like it's been shorter, doesn't it?
It might be.
What do people think of the entire chapter then? We've gone through the fall of the social democrats, the petty bourgeois social democrats. Any overarching thoughts now that we've finished?
Something I thought earlier I didn't get a chance to talk about is, like, so in this we see, like, the consolidation of the executive and the consolidation around, like, a would-be autocrat and Bonaparte. You get the smashing of the petit bourgeois, more or less. Now, does that mean that when it comes to, like, kind of enlightened despotism, which I think has become the predominant model of dictatorships in the 21st century, if some kind of, like, Bonapartist or pseudo-Bonapartist kind of, like, rerunning the constitution so the same guy can be president or prime minister forever, is one of the key things, like, giving the petite bourgeois a political voice versus not? Does that make a difference between, like, a liberal modern society versus, like, an illiberal modern society? Or is there something more to it?
Interesting. I mean, yeah,
I'd
if we're going to
that's
put it in that model.
pretty apt. Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of just the one ruling faction getting a say, you know, you kind of get your incoherent Green Party that could get it together, maybe.
I think of this like the modern Bonapartists being like America and the troops and like the 3%ers, etc. Whereas I see the petite bourgeoisie being a bit more like not necessarily even Silicon Valley types, but
well, what I was getting
Democrats.
Not like different factions or like different like politically or socially motivated actors like the 3%ers or etc., but rather governments, right? Like comparing the U.S. and like, you know, majority of Europe and mean a lot of the world now actually compared to like maybe Russia, or I'm just trying to think of other examples of like kind of illiberal enlightened despotism. Putin is the first person that comes to mind when I'm talking about this. Like,
yeah, I think that the thesis you're putting forward, Sophie, is one that was basically official policy in America under the influence of modernization theory. The idea was that you build a middle class, aka the petit bourgeoisie, and that would build democracy. I mean, I'm just thinking about, so if you're thinking about like liberal presidential republics like France, then the petit bourgeoisie is obviously on its smashed, and there is still some liberalism there. But if you're thinking about things like Putin, I think you probably are more or less right. The only thing I'm wondering about is the case of Singapore, where when I talk to petit bourgeois people in Singapore, I think it was very much like the Second Empire in the sense that they might grouse about the executive power, and they kind of looked upon it as an alien thing in the sense that like court intrigue was really what decided what happened and not what the petit bourgeoisie was doing. But they were also kind of bought into it. Like they were like, nah, yeah, but they managed things pretty well. It very much reminds me of the Second Empire after Louis Napoleon wins. And you have Haussmann takes over rebuilding Paris under a very technocratic program. That's kind of what it reminds me of.
That makes sense. I mean, I guess what I mean is like there exists a class of petite bourgeois, but they're not given a really big say in politics if they're given a say at all. It's kind of what I'm using to like differentiate between like a liberal bourgeois government versus an illiberal bourgeois government.
But if you look at the origins of say Putin in Russia, I would go kind of slightly against what you said, Kyle, that their policy wasn't to create a class of petty bourgeois. It was to create like the American policy was to create an actual class of bourgeois.
But that was after the eclipse of modernization theory. Modernization theory was an attempt to respond to Marxist sort of Soviet political programs in the global South and the Third World. And by the time that the Soviet Union fell, those people were already out.
What are we talking about in terms of decades here?
Roughly the 50s until the 80s.
Post-war compromise.
Yeah, post-war compromise in its foreign policy form, which was literally a response to Marx. It was written as a response to Marx. Yeah.
Okay, so the sort of Western consensus after World War II was, at least in part, built on Beveridge, right? Who I guess you could say is kind of the modern founder of social democracy. And what you mentioned about modernization theory was remarkably close to what I know as Beveridge's full employment in a free society, where you essentially, we can't have any more world wars. Why were there so many world wars? Well, because of inequality within nations and between nations. And so we can't have trade wars anymore, and we can't do like beggar thy neighbor, aggressive dumping the prices on grain or oil in order to screw over your neighbor, essentially, or monopolize stuff. So what we have to do is tax the fuck out of the rich, give it to the poor, have a lot of public investment, print money if we have to in order to keep everyone employed at full employment. Just make sure that we have a huge middle class and essentially have a normal distribution of income and wealth instead of a Pareto distribution.
Yeah, I mean, that's more or less where modernization theory was aiming, but you have to remember it was a program for the third world. So it was much more concerned with the agrarian question and land reform and what to do with the peasants and how to create a proletariat and how to create a middle class, how to create a petty bourgeoisie. It wasn't oriented towards the first world. It was oriented towards the third world. There's a book on this called Mandarins of the Future that is really good. I would recommend reading that one.
On a different note, we should really read Full Employment in a Free Society, because I can't wait to have fisticuffs with you again, Tom, about MMT.
Oh, God.
On this episode, you heard the theme tune The Order of the Pharaonic Jesters and Night of the Purple Moon by Sun Ra and his orchestra. The artwork for the show was created by the Korean artist and author of the 2019 Marx Engels Illustration book. You can check out links to his work and Twitter account in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join me for the next episode of From Alpha to Omega. This show is a member of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast and research collective. Make sure to check out our network sister podcasts, General Intellect Unit, Jumpsuit Utopia, Mortal Science, and Swampside Chats.